This is a summary of Dr. Søberg, How to Use Cold and Heat Exposure to Improve Your Health, where we break down the key insights, ideas, and takeaways from this content, giving you the gist so you can decide if you want the rest. In this episode of the Hubermanlab podcast, Dr. Andrew Huberman speaks with Dr. Susanna Søberg, a leading researcher on cold and heat exposure for metabolic health, stress resilience, and overall well-being. Dr. Søberg explains how strategic use of cold plunges, saunas, and thermoregulation techniques can enhance physical and mental performance. This episode explores the scientific mechanisms behind cold and heat exposure, how they influence metabolism, brain chemistry, and recovery, and the best practices for incorporating them into daily life. The discussion explores how cold exposure activates brown fat, boosts metabolism, and improves insulin sensitivity, the effects of cold exposure on dopamine, stress resilience, and mental focus, the optimal duration and frequency of cold immersion for health benefits, how saunas enhance cardiovascular function, reduce inflammation, and promote longevity, the ideal contrast between cold and heat exposure for maximizing recovery and endurance, practical guidelines for using cold and heat therapy safely and effectively, how cold exposure boosts metabolism and fat burning. Dr. Søberg explains that cold exposure stimulates brown fat, BAT, a type of fat that burns calories to generate heat. Activating brown fat helps increase metabolism and improve glucose regulation. Key metabolic benefits of cold exposure: increases calorie burning by activating brown fat, enhances insulin sensitivity and blood sugar control, improves fat oxidation and metabolic flexibility. How to use cold exposure for metabolic health. Cold plunges or ice baths for 2 to 5 minutes at 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Cold showers for 30 to 60 seconds, gradually increasing duration exposure 2 to 4 times per week for optimal results. Key takeaway: cold exposure activates fat-burning pathways, improves insulin sensitivity, and supports metabolic health. Cold exposure and brain chemistry, how it enhances mood and focus. Dr. Søberg highlights that cold exposure significantly boosts dopamine levels, improving motivation, focus, and stress resilience. How cold exposure affects the brain: increases dopamine by up to 250%, leading to improved mood and mental clarity. Activates norepinephrine, which enhances alertness and reduces inflammation. Builds stress resilience by strengthening the nervous system's response to discomfort. Best practices for maximizing mental benefits: stay in the cold exposure until you experience controlled shivering. Focus on slow, controlled breathing to regulate stress response. Perform exposure early in the day to enhance mental energy. Key takeaway: cold exposure enhances mood, focus, and stress resilience by increasing dopamine and norepinephrine. Heat exposure and sauna use for cardiovascular and longevity benefits. Søberg explains that sauna use provides cardiovascular benefits similar to moderate exercise, reducing the risk of heart disease and promoting longevity. How heat exposure improves health: enhances blood circulation and cardiovascular function, triggers heat shock proteins which repair damaged cells and protect against aging, reduces inflammation and improves immune function. Optimal sauna protocols for health and performance: temperature 80 to 100 degrees Celsius, 76 to 212 for 15 to 20 minutes per session. Frequency 4 to 7 times per week for maximum cardiovascular benefits. Hydrate before and after to prevent dehydration. Key takeaway: regular sauna use improves heart health, reduces inflammation, and enhances longevity. Cold versus heat exposure: when and how to use them for recovery and performance. Dr. Søberg outlines the best ways to use cold and heat exposure based on fitness goals and recovery needs. Cold exposure for recovery and performance: use post-exercise only if the goal is recovery. Cold reduces inflammation but may blunt muscle growth if done immediately after strength training. Best after endurance training to reduce soreness and accelerate recovery. Avoid post-strength training if hypertrophy muscle growth is the goal. Heat exposure for adaptation and longevity. Use saunas post-exercise to enhance circulation and muscle repair. Alternating between cold and heat improves cardiovascular and metabolic health. Heat exposure before exercise can improve flexibility and reduce injury risk. Key takeaway: cold is best for recovery, stress resilience, and metabolic activation, while heat is ideal for cardiovascular health, longevity, and muscle repair. Final takeaways: how to use cold and heat exposure for optimal health. Cold exposure activates brown fat, boosts metabolism, and improves insulin sensitivity. Short, controlled cold plunges or showers increase dopamine and mental resilience. Sauna use improves cardiovascular health, reduces inflammation, and extends lifespan. Cold is best for post-endurance training recovery, but should be avoided immediately after strength training. Heat exposure post-exercise enhances circulation and supports muscle recovery. Alternating between cold and heat exposure provides full-spectrum benefits for performance and longevity. Dr. Søberg concludes that strategic use of cold and heat exposure can improve physical and mental health, strengthen the nervous system, and promote long-term resilience. That's a wrap, Dr. Susanna Søberg, how to use cold and heat exposure to improve your health. If you found this summary valuable, make sure to follow, subscribe, and come back for more in-depth breakdowns of content.